I am not a horror fan. Some of my favorite movies are technically horror, such as John Carpenter's The Thing and the original Alien, but on the whole, I am not really a fan of the genre. This is especially true of video games, where I'm more interested in action horror than actual horror. Creep me out all you like, so long as I can kill everything in my path. In that context, horror simply means be smarter in your approach to shooting things. Yet little old high school me working at GameStop in 2002 fell in love with Resident Evil Remake when it was released for the GameCube. Yes, it gave me the chills and that uncomfortably nervous churn in my gut at points, but what really drew me to the Arklay Mountains and the Spencer Mansion were the same elements that drew me to Super Metroid, a non-linear map to explore and plan my routes in. There may have been greater stakes for failure, and there were days I just had to shut it off because of how frazzled it made me, but every time I started the game anew, I had come up with an improved route through the crazy House of Terrors. I juggled the items in and out of my inventory better. I had known when to pick something up and when to leave it be for the time being. I began to kill zombies more selectively and burning corpses I knew I'd come across again on my favorite routes to prevent them from changing to the deadly Crimson Heads. I'd leave certain zombie or monster-infested rooms condemned for the remainder of the playthrough, never to be entered again. Those were the things that made Resident Evil Remake a favorite of mine. That Resident Evil 4, 3 years later, would also become a favorite could seem contradictory given the changes it had made to the formula, but each title appeals to different aspects of my gaming tastes. The remake offers great replay value through its map exploration, while Resi 4 offers great replay value through combat mastery. The essence of Resident Evil, how I define the core of the franchise, changed slightly from specific mechanics to instead embody an idea, increasing skill and efficiency at the game through repeat playthroughs and refined player knowledge. This essence is very important for what we're about to discuss because going into this video, Resident Evil 7 was a game that I liked, but I disliked playing. It was only in returning to it multiple times for this video that I began to enjoy it more because, despite being a second reinvention of the series, it has retained much of that essence of replayability. I must give warning that I'll be spoiling the game in its entirety in this video. Now is your time to back out if you do not wish to be spoiled. Before getting into the specifics of its design, however, let's talk about horror. Due to their interactive nature, horror video games, especially in first person, give me a greater sense of anxiety than any horror film or Lovecraft story. That I'm the one making the decision, that I'm the one in control, causes my stomach to churn and my nerves to be shot. I never finished Alien Isolation because each night after playing through it, I'd still feel that nervous adrenaline coursing through my chilled veins. For many, that feeling, that tingling in your spine and curling of your toes, is the whole point. It's the natural high that they chase each time they boot up a horror game or film. I, on the other hand, hate that feeling. When I get that unsettling twisting of my stomach, my entire goal is to get rid of it and feel comfortable again. Unfortunately for me, Resident Evil 7 is dedicated to keeping me uncomfortable for as long as possible and making me earn that temporary relief where my gut can unknot and my nerves can settle. It begins with the atmosphere. Now, keep in mind, I don't really play other horror games like Amnesia and only experienced the PT demo once a few years ago, so I don't have a lot of comparison points to make. At the same time, while fans had speculated before the game's release that such horror titles as Amnesia, PT, and the aforementioned Alien Isolation may have had an influence in the game's direction, Capcom producer Masachika Kawata and game director Koshi Nakanichi would explain in interviews that the perspective shift was to appeal to a modern sense of horror and put the player into the protagonist's position. They also explained that VR was a factor, as Sony had recently put out their PSVR peripheral to the PlayStation 4. I cannot argue with the results, as I find the first-person perspective does create a deeper connection with the protagonist Ethan Winters. What it also allows for, however, is closer examination of every little detail in the house. What may seem like a lot of generic and decrepit creepy house art direction can end up carrying a lot of meaning that you may not even pick up on, at least not on a first playthrough. Returning to the second floor of the main house later in the game, I originally couldn't help but ask myself, was it always this dark looking? No, it wasn't, because there wasn't so much mold infecting the second floor, nor were the lights out. In fact, lighting is one of the ways Capcom controls your immersion most effectively. The player doesn't have control of when they use their flashlight, and so sometimes the player is wandering an unnecessarily dark environment simply because the developers wanted a more oppressive atmosphere. Far more than the visuals, however, is the audio. Though I don't have a fancy enough audio setup to take full advantage, the constant sounds of every environment, be it creaking wood or banging metal, keeps the player on edge. Every environment has some sort of diegetic noise. This is all part of the underlying structure of the game. While Capcom wants you to look closely at its environment, and it always wants to keep you on edge, these tricks and traits exist to simply engage that defensive, fight or flight corner of your primitive instincts. This is what gets you immersed into the world as a believable space and not just a video game, maintaining a minimum level of tension. The game will utilize several other tricks in order to increase that tension, but they don't work half as well if the player isn't first immersed enough to believe their environment is threatening. Of course, there are no doubt people that these environmental tricks will be less effective on, but for me, no matter how many times I replayed or intended on grabbing specific footage, on how prepared I was to face the game and its AI as an artificial construct, I could not help but become engrossed in the experience. As I said, however, these aural and visual techniques were just the backdrop. To examine Capcom's careful execution beyond these elements, let's closely examine the opening tutorial. Much like the original Resident Evil, we begin our adventure with a simple mystery. What happened to protagonist Ethan Winter's wife Mia? After going missing for 3 years, she sends a brief, mysterious email to Ethan asking him to come find her. Whereas the original Resident Evil began with some crazy action and immediate introduction to the supernatural threat, Resident Evil 7 instead takes its time. You begin outside in the daylight, but the utter stillness of the Baker house and surrounding land is enough to be unsettling. The hue of the setting sun provides a harsh yellow haze over everything you see, and as you progress forward you encounter odd, even disturbing imagery. An abandoned van, a man with a zombie-like gaze and gait that seemingly vanishes into thin air, wire, buzzsaws, and cow parts arranged to look like some sign of Baphomet, as if a warning to would-be trespassers. A pile of burnt belongings, including a purse with Mia's driver's license in it. It is clear that something is wrong in Dolby, Louisiana, but if you're playing a horror game, well, of course there's something awful happening, right? This is part of the trick, the expectation. When you obtain the derelict house VHS tape and discover what happened to the crew of the van, you'll hear the Sewer Gators show's host, Peter Walken, talk down the location as being pretty generic.
What's the prep? Shitty house, spooky sounds? Ooh, is it haunted?
The tape itself is a narrative and mechanical tool to explain the abandoned vehicle outside. It introduces the concept of trapdoors and that not all is what it may seem, that there is something dangerous and malicious on the property. Those last 2 points are perhaps the most important, as this is a game where what you see on the surface is often misleading, and the game wants to push the player into danger. The player knows that Andre, the producer of the Sewer Gators television show, was murdered beyond that trap door, and that something clearly happened to Clancy the cameraman and Peter the show host. This is what I mean by the audio and visuals being the backdrop of the horror, but not necessarily the cause of the horror. Now that the player knows where the danger could be lurking, the designers build tension by forcing the player to walk towards the danger in order to progress. There is no hiding, there is no easy route. Either you go forward, or you might as well shut off the game. Breaking Mia free introduces the player to the mechanics of using certain items as keys for progression, but more importantly, we curiously find our objective immediately. We just arrived and yet we've already found Mia, and physically she seems fine. Mentally, on the other hand, she's a bit manic and she continually mentions someone named Daddy. Finding Mia should have been a relief, but instead it continues to build tension. Who is this Daddy? Just what did he do to Mia? By the time she's freaking out about a missing door, the player is primed to start questioning her sanity, only to then believe someone might have taken her once Ethan's back is turned. It turns out there was a door there after all. Again, not everything is what it first seems to be on the surface. The player truly finds out what this means after wandering the upper floor seeking Mia, only to hear a knocking from the basement door from which they just came. It turns out Mia wasn't taken from the couch in the basement, nor is she physically fine. Mia has become something else, and Ethan's missing wife has now become the danger we've been dreading. The game will prompt the player to resist, but Ethan gets a knife through the hand anyway. Another prompt, and now Ethan's palms get sliced. We're in the tutorial, which should be the safest part of the game, and our protagonist is getting severely wounded by his wife. The button prompts don't actually matter. What is happening? The player gets an axe. Okay, Ethan is armed now, and the player is getting actual combat instructions. This is the part of the tutorial where the player learns about melee combat. This is the part where the player learns to kill Ethan's wife. The thing about tension is that it cannot be sustained forever. It needs to snap at some point, and once the adrenaline and the excitement has receded, it will create an emotional vacuum. At this moment, that vacuum becomes filled with an uncomfortable calm as well as confusion. This is Ethan's wife, the objective upon which this game's premise hangs. She is now dead at the player's feet. What now? What's next? The player's attention is taken from Mia's corpse into a phone call from a mysterious stranger, another distraction, and allowing for yet another mysterious vanishing act. Mia is gone now, but the axe remains. Was she not dead after all? The tension resets and slowly builds once more as the player again must step forward towards potential danger. Once the player obtains the fuse for the attic, Mia can be seen wandering in the direction that they must inevitably go, towards the living room and stairwell. At this point, the player doesn't know what to expect, doesn't know what further damage can be done, nor where the next attack will come from. Mia ambushes Ethan, seeming to have reverted back to normal, but any suspicion is quickly confirmed as she transforms and pins the player in place. If you thought a knife in the hand was brutal, the opening plays with the expectations of tutorials and QuickTime events in such an excellent way, especially after Resident Evil 6 had relied so heavily on button mashing prompts to deliver a cinematic experience. Here, the prompts to these cinematic scripted sequences mean nothing. Ethan will always become gravely wounded no matter what the player does. The only thing that matters is when you are directly in control, such as the fight with the axe. While getting your hand chopped off releases some tension, it continues to be elevated due to the dismemberment of Ethan's hand as well as the mystery of where Mia has gone. Every time the game has thus far steered the player into danger, it has built tension. Every time the player followed a prompt, Ethan got hurt anyway. Just when the player thought they killed Mia, it turned out she was still alive. These twists and turns and playing with expectations are what build upon the visual and aural presentation of the game's environment, and they manage the tension by building it up to a climax only to let it settle back down, but with minimal calm. The player is always kept on their toes, and the game will play with these tricks and concepts from start to finish. Remember, not everything is what it seems, and this is particularly true in regards to a seemingly meaningless photo of an old lady in a wheelchair found right after discovering Mia in the basement. The section concludes with one more fight against Mia, but even as she drops to her knees and delivers her seemingly heartbreaking final words, the player cannot trust she's actually dead. She survived an axe to the neck after all. The game allows the player enough time to stew in that sudden calm, wondering what to even do next or if Mia's just going to get back up, before one final ambush in the guest house.
Welcome to the family, son.
Now, instead of continuing to go through the game sequentially, I'll be discussing it topic by topic and building off of that introduction. We'll begin with the game mechanics of Jack and Marguerite Baker, particularly as wandering monsters, because they are not only a major feature of Resident Evil 7 and greatly factor into its horror, but they have also gone on to influence this new generation of Resident Evil as a whole. I'll dive deeper into the narrative in the latter half of this video, but waking up at the Baker dinner table acts as a brief introduction to our three major threats: Lucas, Marguerite, and Jack Baker. Players may realize that this daddy Mia was afraid of is none other than Jack, the man who just knocked out Ethan and is now chopping off his son's arm and administering torture. Once again, we're establishing tension. Jack is clearly the most dangerous of this group, so even after everyone clears out, he's the one the player is least likely to want to come across. It's only natural then that he's the one the player is going to have to evade. The player is unarmed and in an unfamiliar house. When it came time to confront Mia earlier, the game had always provided a means of defense. Now the player is up against Jack, but there's not a weapon in sight. The layout of the west wing of the first floor is an interesting one, because the player's objective, the key to the crawlspace beneath the pantry, is located at the end of the hall, precisely where Jack spawns in from. The player's instinct and only reasonable choice is to run and hide, but there are very few safe spots the player can duck into without being seen. While the player can easily hide down in the stairwell leading to the garage, waiting for Jack to pass by to inspect the kitchen and dining area, once they retrieve the key, they will inevitably have to make their way back down the hall and risk being seen in that same kitchen and dining area that Jack will be patrolling. Once again, the player must be willing to confront their fears and walk into danger. Additionally, the house is built in such a way that you cannot see where Jack is, but you can certainly hear his footsteps and his taunts. While the living room, dining room, and kitchen are built in a manner that the player can outrun Jack, it's cramped enough with few hiding spots that getting spotted is almost inevitable. This, I believe, is by design, as the developers clearly want the player to be seen and pursued for a few reasons. The first is to intimidate, yes, but to also teach the player that getting seen is not the end. The chase creates a sort of dynamic rising and falling of tension, where the player may panic and desperately seek escape once Jack is on the prowl, but also provide a degree of relaxation once it is clear Jack can't see them anymore. Additionally, so long as the player is spotted before heading down the hallway, Jack will burst through the wall from the pantry. The initial response is to once again panic, as walls aren't even a safe barrier from this son of a gun. However, this also allows the player an additional route to run through in order to avoid Jack. It actually makes things easier for the player, so long as they keep calm, to dodge and run away from him to obtain that key. If you're able to hide somewhere like the steps to the garage, then you'll have no shortcut to the pantry, nor a quick escape route from the pantry should you get spotted. Speaking of, should Jack be close enough to the player as they try to use the key and escape through the crawlspace, a scripted scene will play out wherein Jack will chop off Ethan's leg, further brutalizing our protagonist. There are technically other instances in which this can happen in the game, but this is the most likely the player will encounter. We'll discuss the significance of this scene later on, but most players will have a similar reaction to Ethan.
What the fuck?
It doesn't surprise me that the opening hour of this game is so memorable and iconic. Capcom put a lot of effort into making sure these segments were surprising and completely subverted player expectations, even those that might have already experienced other first-person horror games. At the same time, measures are taken to feel more threatening than it really is. Ethan's hand getting stabbed and chopped off, and even the leg being removed, are all illusions. Ethan isn't in any more danger than he was previously. These are tricks to make the player panic. Jack's second phase of roaming can easily be avoided, especially if the player has already gotten the dog's head relief from the grandfather clock in the living room and fully explored the second floor before going into the bathroom, where draining the bathtub reactivates Jack. While you'll still need to escape him after that, the second floor has at least 3 circular pathways the player can travel to shake him off. It's a far more open and forgiving space than the first floor by far, and should you run into Jack in the main hall, the 2 separate sets of stairs on either side allow for potential escape routes. Or you just duck back into the Scorpion Key door and decide that the main hall is now condemned until further notice. It may seem like understanding Jack's AI better might make him less intimidating, but, well, he's not, because he's pretty much invincible in this state. He can be temporarily incapacitated, but he'll inevitably get back up and start wandering again. The same is true for Marguerite, who wanders the old house of the lantern. She isn't as fast as Jack is, but she'll attack with a swarm of insects if she spots the player. Similar to the first floor of the main house, the player will have to traverse through this hallway and this kitchen should they wish to make progress, with a couple potential routes allowing them to circumvent Marguerite. However, there are bug nests to be concerned about and a spider-infested door blocking the way, hindering some of those options at first. The one tool the player has is being able to peer through the windows to monitor Marguerite's location. This is particularly effective when trying to watch her through the kitchen window, though you can also see she can get stuck on this nest at points, it seems. From a personal perspective, these sections where you're trying to avoid the Baker parents are the highlight of the game for me. Despite having played through numerous times now, despite having a better understanding of the AI, how it functions, and the limitations, the game's atmosphere and the ever-present threat of these characters always drives a chill up my spine and knots up my stomach. Whereas Mia's presence in the guest house was nothing more than parlor tricks and scripted events, Jack and Marguerite are actually wandering, and thus you have to consider your approach carefully. Now, while Jack and Marguerite are invulnerable while roaming the environment, the player will inevitably have to clash with them in some form of arena. The first fight with Jack is incredibly memorable due to how it keeps surprising the player, namely with the car. If the player never figures out they can get in and drive, then Jack will hop on in himself for some donuts and attempted vehicular homicide. The best way to conserve ammunition in this fight is to grab the car keys yourself, hop into the driver's seat, and slam into Jack repeatedly until he seemingly vanishes, only to rip the hood off and take control of the vehicle. Just as things had continued to escalate with Mia, Jack continues to escalate things as well, and for a brief moment the player may believe getting into the car is a mistake. Now, however, the player has an opportunity to see the regenerative abilities of the mysteriously infected Bakers firsthand. You can see Jack's eye moving as his face slowly heals while Ethan gets out of the car, and even watch as Jack walks out of the now burning vehicle as if his flesh isn't in flames. The fight is technically over once the car explodes, but the player can't leave the arena before one last surprise.
Do I have your attention, boy? You're about to see something wonderful. Whoa. Fuck!
If there is any problem with this fight, it's that it sets up expectations in the mind of the player. If the player can conserve ammunition by using the car instead of the gun, what other set-piece tricks might the other fights have? What kind of spectacle does this game have in store? Well, the next fight with Jack begins to scale things down, though not without retaining some degree of memorability. With Jack utilizing two chainsaws MacGyvered together into monstrous shears, the player can pick up a chainsaw of their own to, once again, conserve ammunition. The player can also kick these corpse bags into Jack as well to knock him off guard, all coming together to create a unique set piece that makes this into a rather entertaining duel of two chainsaw-wielding men. Jack's mutation begins to go out of hand, revealing a weak point, just in case you were starting to think this wasn't a Resident Evil game, and things finally conclude with Jack's entire torso exploding, oozing gore and muck onto the floor. If there are separate short-term and long-term methods of building tension, then this was the moment all that long-term tension that began at the game's start snapped. All of the escalation and subverting of expectations, it concludes here with Jack seemingly down for good. First, it turns out an axe in Mia's neck isn't enough to kill her after all. Then, Jack is able to survive a steel beam to the face at high speed, to survive burning alive, and to survive a car explosion. After blowing out his own brain pan, he then walks through the bathroom door like it's just a flesh wound, only for the player to see some weird growth coming out of his back and for his torso to burst apart. At this stage, it feels like the player has seen everything. Marguerite seems comparatively tame at first, with slower movement than Jack, but her ability to spawn bugs and giant hornets is a bit unnerving. It's not until after a minor scuffle, however, that we see a lanky, mutated arm reach out and snatch the lantern, followed by a very strange body scrambling down an underground tunnel. While Jack had retained a generally human shape, Marguerite has fully transformed into some human-spider hybrid. This is where the scripted gimmicks end, and it's all about the player's ability to maneuver around the environment and gun down Marguerite. She can crawl along the walls and even squeeze into windows or cramped spaces to weave through the greenhouse, and should the player hear her moaning in pain, it's an indication that she's about to spawn some monstrous hornets to help her out. It's a tricky fight that requires the player to be cautious of where they stand, to always be chasing down Marguerite and prevent her from spawning more giant bugs. It's also the first fight that really drains your ammo resources. In one playthrough on normal, I had been nearly depleted. It was only with some more powerful weaponry and smarter planning on a separate playthrough that I still had ammunition left afterward. The final confrontation with Jack, however, is perhaps the least interesting conceptually. Shoot the monstrosity in all of its big, glowing eyeballs, which is about as Resident Evil as it gets. The player will constantly need to be on the move, dropping to the lower floor and then sprinting back up to make sure they get every eye on Jack's body as well as avoiding his attacks, particularly the acid spray. Once you get the hang of it, the fight's really not too difficult and Jack goes down for good. To me, these are the highlights of Resident Evil 7, at least from a threat level. Hiding from Jack and Marguerite when they're wandering around, and then finally confronting them in set-piece boss fights are some of the better moments of the game to me. If you've played Resident Evil 7 yourself though, you'll notice I've left out a major factor of this game. Lucas for sure, but I'll discuss him later on. No, there's another monster roaming the Baker estate, and unfortunately, I'm not as fond of them as I am of Jack and Marguerite. The Molded are effectively the new zombies for Resident Evil 7. They're the shambling monster that roams a decrepit old house, or at least certain parts of it, that the player must evade or confront if they wish to survive. I don't know if I dislike the Molded or how Capcom handled this new creature, because the first impression is at least very effective. Unexpectedly emerging from the black mold covering the wall is an excellent reveal, and it continually raises the tension as the player must then gaze down into the dark, foreboding basement. The player must descend to progress through the game, but with great uncertainty as to what they could encounter. Once Ethan turns on the flashlight, they'll see that same black mold everywhere. If these creatures can just emerge from the walls, then you never know when you'll be ambushed. Oh, they're just standing around waiting for the player to show up. This is where that careful balance of tension and immersion starts to break down. In the original Resident Evil, you can understand why the undead are standing around until a living creature happens to cross into their vicinity. Zombies are literally brain dead and driven by a primal hunger, so if there's nothing to consume, they'd have no reason to wander around. By being undead, it also makes sense that they'd occupy whatever space they happen to die in. Here, the placement of the molded, and even how numerous they are in the basement, reveals the presence of the game developer in this otherwise immersive world. When you reach the rectanker in the latter half of the game, you can see molded patrolling a set path in select hallways rather than wandering the environment in any natural fashion. All the atmosphere, the carefully crafted AI behavior of Jack and Marguerite, all the things used to invest the player in their immersion is shaken by the molded. Which isn't to say immersion is broken completely. The basement is actually another intelligently and intentionally designed area, forcing the player through a narrow corridor with lots of sudden turns in order to keep them on their toes. You don't know when a molded will appear, and when they do, they're already in close proximity to the player. This effectively builds and releases the tension, but it also means that a player can easily become trapped in this cramped space. This is where we come to the most difficult balancing act of any horror game: how to handle failure and consequence. Ideally, the cost of failure isn't immediate death, but healing and ammunition resources. With Jack and Marguerite, you're more likely to expend resources than to die. With the molded, you're expending resources no matter what, but if you get trapped and cornered, then you are probably going to die. The problem with death is that it thoroughly breaks the immersion. It resets the tension to absolutely zero, and all the time the player had been absorbed into the verisimilitude of the game world vanishes. Now, most instances where the player gets surrounded can be avoided, but as I had stated, the player is now thinking purely as a video game if they are reloading a save and trying again. It's not fear that a monster can crawl out from anywhere, it's making a mental note of enemy spawn points. It is knowing that Capcom expects you to fight these creatures rather than dodge and avoid them. Shoot them in the leg, they just become enraged. Shoot their arm off, they're less effective, but they can still hurt you and you just spent more ammunition than necessary. Unless you want to use your knife, but that hardly does any damage and yeah, I think I'll just stick to the gun. When the molded show up, we're right back to being action horror instead of survival horror, and they feel completely out of place with everything Capcom had established in the guest house and top 2 floors of the main house. This is especially true later in the game when the player is granted a better arsenal of weaponry. Swapping between remote bombs, high-powered shotguns, and rapid-fire machine guns feels like a softer interpretation of the more action-oriented resourcefulness that made Resident Evil 4 so enjoyable, which, again, goes against the effort of making this game a survival horror. This isn't to say that the molded must be fought at all times. There are some scenarios where it definitely benefits the player to circle around them or flee, but these moments are far fewer in number than simply taking them out head on. I'm sure there are players that have done challenge runs where they don't kill any molded, or they only kill mandatory molded or something, but the game just doesn't feel designed with that intention in mind. Perhaps the real issue is also the sheer lack of variety. You have your standard molded, your armored arm molded, which might as well just be another standard molded, the quick, annoying as hell creepy crawly molded, and then the fat man, which is effectively treated as a mini boss fight whenever he appears. That's it, just those 4, and your best strategy for taking all of them out is the M21 shotgun or a remote bomb. The molded aren't enough to ruin the game for me, as they are still a proper threat. In fact, because I enjoy action horror over survival horror, I can still find enjoyment in avoiding or taking that threat out, even if I'm finding ways to cheese that threat. However, I was actually enjoying the experience as a survival horror, and the implementation of the molded is jarring and contradictory to how the game had been set up. Their placement throughout the environment especially feels sloppy in a game where all other aspects of the design feel so carefully considered and intentional. I mean, spawning 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and maybe 6 molded leading up to and entering the boiler room, back to back to back to back to back, is just ridiculous and breaks the immersive world the game had so carefully been building up before. Every time you encounter the molded, the hands of the game designers are more visible than ever. As I said at the start of the video, the original Resident Evil appealed to me because navigating the Spencer Mansion was as enjoyable as navigating a game like Super Metroid. Even Capcom themselves referred to it as a Metroidvania style in their 2017 GDC panel. Your first time through will be the longest, sloppiest, least efficient playthrough. Every return is an attempt to be just a bit better at the game, to tackle things a bit more efficiently, and to experiment and test out new tricks or strategies. The Baker Estate, on the other hand, isn't designed as strongly for such replayability. It is to an extent, such as knowing how to get the shotgun, or sticking to just the handgun until you get the gun repair kit outside beneath the porch. You can conserve all your shotgun ammunition for when you can fix the broken shotgun into the M21, one of the most powerful guns in the game. You'll have more than enough ammunition for Marguerite, but you'll also have a more difficult time down in the basement, even if you are using the Albert replica handgun rewarded from beating the game at least once. Even so, there are fewer branching paths or options available in Resident Evil 7 than faced in the original game. While the first Resident Evil had a sense of guided progression due to which keys you could find at a time, there was more wiggle room into what order the player explored that limited space and discovered the necessary items to progress further. The Gaming Brit covers this a decent amount in his Road to the Rocket Launcher series. With Resident Evil 7, you're pretty much restricted directly to where they want you to be, with each key you find only unlocking a limited, restricted path forward. I think the primary cause of this limitation is to dedicate the majority of the space to the roaming presence of the Bakers. The player will need somewhere to run through should they wish to avoid Jack or Marguerite, and thus each building must be built to accommodate both the AI pathing and player escape routes. Too many locked doors would be too restrictive for this purpose. I would also say that there's a real lack of interesting puzzles to the game as well. Even Resident Evil 4, which kickstarted the action horror direction of the series, has more puzzles in it than Resident Evil 7. In fact, I'm pretty sure most of the game's puzzles are just these shadow manipulations, and then the Saw-inspired escape room. The boathouse and the mines at the end are linear experiences that funnel the player into one direction. The only real trick to them is knowing when to turn around and take out the molded that spawned behind you, which makes the wrecked tanker an interesting location to discuss, because what started as my most hated part of the game, and seems to largely be disliked by the community, has now become a highlight for me, if only because navigating its space is the closest to what that original mansion represented. The player has 2 separate keys located on 2 different floors that they must obtain if they wish to progress, and they can choose whichever they wish to go fetch first. Too bad one is immensely more optimal to go after first than the other, meaning the player will just make the same decisions every time anyway. Even so, even after the player has adjusted to the molded as a threat, this space is the least linear portion of the map while still retaining that survival horror atmosphere. The player begins with few weapons and little ammunition, building up to a proper arsenal through careful exploration while trimming down or evading enemies. It may not be great, but it's something. The Baker Estate is primarily designed excellently in terms of visual fidelity, believability, and dropping little narrative hints from start to finish. The adherence to a tense and frightful atmosphere is particularly strong in both the basement, despite my feelings on the molded, and in the upper floor of the old house. The game really knows how to deliver that creepy tone, but for those claiming it went back to the roots of the original Resident Evil, it kind of falters in regards to the replayability that old Spencer Mansion provided. In other words, Resident Evil 7 isn't really much of a Metroidvania, but for this game, I think that's fine enough since it is a unique experience on its own. The way I see it, the Baker Estate is still as much of a character to Resident Evil 7 as the Spencer Mansion was to the original. Mechanically speaking, I enjoy Resident Evil 7, but it's not one of my favorite entries to play in this series. In regards to narrative and themes, however, I feel like this is the best Resident Evil has been, and unfortunately is unlikely to be this good again anytime soon. To make sure my stance is clear, I believe lore is not the same thing as story, and copious amounts of lore does not mean the lore is good. If anything, lore is half the reason the Resident Evil franchise can be so notoriously stupid. One of the central themes to Resident Evil 7 is family, and it seems to be carrying forward to all three mainline Resident Evil games of this generation. However, I believe there are other underlying ideas such as corruption, or perhaps a hidden darkness, that supplements that theme in Resident Evil 7. Earlier on, I also mentioned things not being what they seem, such as the decrepit old house being more than it looked. I pointed to hidden levers and doorways, and even Mia herself as examples. So let's examine these ideas as they relate to the Bakers, a seemingly twisted hillbilly bunch that play off of stereotypes and expectations of the creepy Texas Chainsaw yokel. From their accents to the way they talk, everything seems stereotypical.
Hit boy's got to eat. He got to have his supper. Sorry, Ethan.
I'll feed you to my babies and fertilize the garden with what was left.
In reality, however, each of these characters is a twisted interpretation of a familial concept. Jack is the patriarch, the father, but when we see him chop off Lucas's hand, it's an extreme, twisted concept of discipline. Lucas shouts "not again" as if to imply this is a regular occurrence, and in the daughter's DLC we can find a stress-relieving journal where Lucas expresses anger at being chewed out for just such misbehavior. Jack's discipline of Lucas and torture of Ethan is an intimidating tactic for the early game, but it's also an evil exaggeration of his role in establishing and maintaining order in the family. Even when he transforms into a massive monstrosity of mold and muck, he speaks to his daughter Zoe as a father ready to usher out discipline.
Zoe! Get your ass back to the house! I will deal with you later!
His weaponry primarily consists of common household tools used for groundskeeping and maintenance, reflecting the traditional role of a father as caretaker. Each tool has been modified and twisted for brutality. Simultaneously, being a mother is very important to Marguerite, as seen not only in her transformation to a bug-birthing Spider-Woman, but in her twisted obsession with Evelyn and her alter to what is effectively a stillborn fetus. Her very introduction shows just how much she cares about feeding her family and guests, taking it as a personal insult when Ethan spits the food out.
Shit, he's not eating it, Jack! He's not eating it!
Get the hell up, Marguerite!
I made that for him!
Get the hell out of here!
You're a son of a bitch!
What strikes home the most, I think, is how Marguerite speaks to Mia, or even the hateful notes she writes to Zoe. If you're unfortunate enough to be familiar with spiteful women that get heated with one another, then some of the twisted things said to her daughter, or judgmental insinuations towards Mia, will sound tragically familiar. While the Daughters DLC is a bit questionable in its continuity, given the timeline of events is inconsistent with the main game, it does give a glimpse into this family before they had become corrupted. It's only little moments and hints, but Jack is shown to be a loving father and husband willing to go out of his way to help strangers, and Marguerite is much the same. It's only after the dreaded mold infection takes over that they turn into violent sociopaths. Then there's Lucas. Well, he's a bit of a different story, isn't he? When Ethan has some sort of dreamlike conversation with Jack Baker, the father has this to say.
I'm no killer, son. Neither is Marguerite. No, my boy Lucas.
Except there is direct evidence in the house that Lucas is, in fact, a killer and capable of evil. In his old bedroom, we find a document where Marguerite had taken Lucas to the doctor to get his head examined when he was a child. Shortly after, we read about how Lucas tricked a child named Oliver, who had teased him and called him a crazy head, trapping Oliver in his attic. Lucas knowingly left this child in the attic until, finally, the child died. Perhaps this was the only such incident, but as early as the Derelict House VHS tape, we hear the Sewer Gators producer Andre refer to Lucas as a bad seed.
A lot of bad rumors about their son, Lucas. Bad seed, apparently.
In Lucas's document in the Daughters DLC I referenced earlier, he curses out anyone that makes him angry, and there's an implication he has a potentially perverse interest in his sister. All signs point to Lucas being a disturbed individual. By the end of the game, listening in on the chatter between Chris Redfield and his team, we discover that Lucas has been in contact with Mia's former employers. Further in the mine, we find an email Lucas had sent indicating that Evelyn's hold on him had been severed a good amount of time before the game takes place. In other words, every interaction we've had with Lucas this entire game has purely been of him and not Evelyn's influence. As Jack explains to Ethan, Evelyn gets into your mind and has a way of making you do things you normally wouldn't. We can even see this towards the game's end, where Ethan's first confrontation with Mia is recontextualized with Evelyn's presence. However, Lucas has been free of that control for a long time. Long enough that the torture he put cameraman Clancy through was not the infection, but all him. Not only is Lucas a killer, he is a sociopath. This speech given to Ethan is how he truly feels.
She thinks this thing is special. No, Ethan. That ain't special. This right here is special. You see, Ethan? Not everybody wants to turn back the clock. What? What, Evelyn? I'm just trying to show him. Not everybody wants to go back to how things were. Those are stupid bitch. She doesn't understand that I don't want to go back to how things were before my father found y'all. Not everybody wants to turn back the clock.
Resident Evil 7 isn't a story about evil corporations doing generically evil things because they're comically evil. Unlike the rest of the franchise, Resident Evil 7 is a small, focused story on a family that was bound for tragedy whether Evelyn and Mia showed up or not. Jack, Marguerite, and Zoe were pretty average, mundane even, but they weren't awful people. Lucas, on the other hand, was not average or mundane. He was a mechanical genius, yes, but he also had no empathy for others. Even when young Oliver continued to knock on his attic door, Lucas simply complained about the noise. Jack and Marguerite were twisted against their will into a monstrous form of a father and mother. Lucas, on the other hand, was enabled. Of course, there would be no infection without Evelyn. I've mentioned her a few times, but I haven't really focused on her. Evelyn is the latest bioweapon who managed to break free from a crime syndicate called the Connections. That, of course, isn't really important. What is important is that Mia, Ethan's wife, was her handler, and it was Mia whom Evelyn decided would be her mother. Near the end of the game, you'll find a ramshackle laboratory put together by Lucas, filled with notes regarding Evelyn and her power over a fungus referred to as the mutamycete. Those infected with the mutamycete, what is referred to as the mold throughout the game, either die, become the molded, or become a controlled vessel such as the Bakers or Mia. As an aside, I can only imagine Zoe, who herself has become infected, is only in so much control of herself because she keeps a distance from the rest of the family. It's not really explained in the game. Within those documents in the lab, however, the scientists of the Connections speculate that Evelyn instinctively plays on the emotions of others in order to better blend into the populace. The remark that a sentimental sort may suggest Evelyn actually yearns for a family is made almost dismissively, as if it is far less likely this child would want a family than they would be some scheming saboteur. Yet that's precisely what drives Evelyn. A child born in a lab without parents, without love, that desires nothing more than a family. Unfortunately, much like a child without a proper upbringing might, Evelyn attempts to force this family. She tries to make people love her, to take the role of father, mother, or sibling, and when they refuse, she attempts to punish. As a child might, she is always pushing the blame on others and trying to hide her pain with vindictive, petty laughter or mockery.
We can't be a family. We were never a family. We will never be a family.
Then I don't need you anymore.
Which ultimately makes Evelyn a tragic character as well. She did not choose the circumstances of her birth, and it is not her fault that she was raised, well, she wasn't raised. The scientists and handlers did not treat her as a child in need of love, affection, and discipline, but as a weapon and asset. When you give an emotional child immense power capable of causing great harm, you end up with one horrific temper tantrum. So it is that, when Ethan finally drives the needle that will put an end to Evelyn for good, she finally expresses all of her pain and hurt.
Why does everyone hate me?
And then they immediately ruin it with camp.
Damn you! Damn you all to hell!
Nothing is what it seems to be, and that includes the psychic little ghost girl. As I noted early in this video, at the very start of the game, right after freeing Mia from the basement, you can find a photo of an old lady with the code E001 on the back. As the game progresses, we'll see this old lady periodically, even located in dangerous places. It's as if anytime you've forgotten about her, the game drops her right in the middle of things to remind you of her existence. The email Lucas had sent includes a note of Evelyn rapidly aging, hinting towards this reveal. However, as if to make it clear, when you exit the mines and emerge back in the basement of the guest house, right before your final confrontation with Evelyn, there is a wheelchair beside the doll of a little black-haired girl. The game is giving you all the hints you need to know that Evelyn has been there the whole time, watching, observing, and trying to stop you. Yes, the end of the game is still bombastic, and you still face Evelyn as some monstrosity of muck and mold in a cinematic set piece where half of your actions don't even matter, just like at the start of the game. However, despite all of this, Resident Evil 7 manages to tell a story of, well, of the impossible standard of the perfect family. Even before Evelyn showed up, the Bakers were not the perfect family. They were in denial about the true nature of their son, who had been responsible for the death of another child. All Evelyn wanted was a family of her own, but due to the circumstances of her birth and the gift of monstrous powers that no child should be able to wield, she was ultimately the cause of her own suffering and her own undoing. Nothing is what it seems, be it the psycho hillbilly family or the seemingly perfect family who was in denial about their son's moral compass. It's a tragic and personal story, but it's not complete yet, not without discussing one more character. There's not actually a lot that can be said of Ethan Winters, really. He's intentionally a bit of a blank slate, though when he does speak for himself, he ends up sounding, well, like a bit of a jerk, quite frankly. He comes off like a fool when he's trying to convince the cop to help him, a cop that shortly after meets his demise, and when Zoe isn't at the trailer, he's ready to tear her a new one over the phone. Understandably to some extent, she might have stapled his hand back on. Wait, when did she do that? When did she give him that watch? How did the rest of the Bakers not notice this? But Zoe otherwise keeps her distance while Ethan is left to face the danger alone. The game then leaves Ethan the choice to use the one and only serum on either Mia or Zoe, with Mia being the canonical choice. When Mia chooses to thank Ethan...
Who the hell else was I gonna choose?
Ethan.
I find it interesting Mia is offended by the way Ethan says this, but it reflects a complete lack of regret or sympathy on Ethan's part. Nonetheless, it's kind of understandable. Be it chewing who he thinks is Zoe out on the phone, or choosing Mia, he didn't ask to be in the middle of this situation. He is clearly stressed out, and his goal the entire time has been to reunite with and save his wife. Yet I think it continues to fit in that space of things not being what they seem or a darkness lurking within, and he and Mia's relationship itself isn't exactly the perfect power couple. While there isn't much to go off of, the game opens up with two distinct messages. The first one is literally sunshine and kisses as Mia seems to be the perfectly adoring wife notifying her husband she'll be home soon. But then this is immediately followed up with another, darker message.
Ethan. You were right. I did lie to you. I shouldn't have. All I can say is that if you get this, stay away.
We can only speculate that it was Mia's profession, a handler to Evelyn while working for the criminal syndicate The Connections, that she lied about, but the very fact that she says you were right indicates that there was suspicion on Ethan's part. Odds are the two had conflict in the past. Not everything is what it seems, and the very opening of the game communicates this regarding Ethan and his marriage with Mia. Yet, despite all that, Ethan chooses to go to his wife and, canonically speaking at least, gives the serum to her. If you give it to Zoe instead, then the game just kills Zoe anyway and washes Mia up outside the wrecked tanker. You then have to fight Mia one last time after she frees Ethan from Evelyn's mold cocoon. There's not much else to discuss about Ethan otherwise, except for something that factors into Resident Evil Village. Now, this could count as a spoiler for that game, so I'll put a timestamp up here in case you want to skip any Resident Evil Village story details. While it's something Resident Evil 7 hints at, it's treated as a big reveal in Village, so if you don't wish to know, skip to the timestamp on screen right about now. So, Ethan dies in this game. No, I don't mean when the player dies. I mean he does not survive that first encounter with Mia or Jack. This is spelled out in Village, but all of the hints are here in Resident Evil 7, beginning with the optional scene where Jack cuts off Ethan's leg. Perhaps you can stretch your suspension of disbelief enough to believe his hand can be stapled back on, but simply splashing some first aid onto a severed leg to reattach it? However, towards the end of the game, in the mine laboratory with all the documentation on Evelyn, the player will learn about the regenerative nature of the mold infection. While this may at first explain Jack or Mia's ability to survive, the specific mention of reattaching limbs brings to mind Ethan's severed leg. There is also mention of how Evelyn begins to appear in one's mind. If someone is not infected with the mold, then they simply will not see these psychic projections of Evelyn. It will appear as if the infected are speaking with themselves when they are, in fact, speaking with Evelyn. Mia may seem crazy at the beginning of the game, but then at the end we see that Evelyn was goading Mia the whole time. So when does Ethan see young Evelyn? Not until he's on the upper floor of the old house, and even then it's a brief shot of Evelyn running away. Most of our interaction with young Evelyn isn't until the wrecked tanker, and that's through the eyes and perspective of Mia. That Ethan is seeing Evelyn at all reveals that he has been dead and infected since Jack curb stomped him. There is some speculation and question among the fanbase regarding how Ethan never succumbs to Evelyn's control, but I think he actually has, just to a limited extent. Whenever you approach Evelyn in her real physical state, before you even know she is Evelyn, the player cannot aim or fire their weapon at her. While this is clearly so the game can happen as the developers intend, it also makes a degree of sense that, despite the strength of Ethan's will, he cannot resist Evelyn's control completely yet. Even the psychic blasts from Evelyn, are they real? Or are they an effort to exert control that Ethan is simply fighting? Is wife-killing Ethan just the right kind of jerk to be willing to murder a child? Okay, a bit too far there, and honestly I would say the game is a bit too inconsistent with some of its rules. Give the serum to Mia, and Evelyn is still connected enough to psychically project herself to Mia, as well as begin to turn her again. Give the serum to Zoe, and Evelyn is able to calcify and kill her anyway. You could argue the serum takes time to remove the infection, but it seems pretty fast acting for someone too far gone like Jack. I think the more plausible explanation is that Jack and Marguerite were not only in denial of Lucas, but also in denial of Evelyn being trouble. As I said, despite the pace at which the Daughters DLC portrays Evelyn's takeover, there's a note in the game detailing the results of a doctor's visit Marguerite had weeks after Evelyn's arrival. It is likely that the intended continuity was that Evelyn's takeover of Jack and Marguerite had taken several weeks, and now, 3 years later, the hold on their minds and bodies was just too strong. Zoe managed to escape early enough to retain control of her own mind, presumably. Regardless of that speculation, Ethan himself is, once again, a representation of not all being what it seems. We also see that he himself is capable of doing terrible things if driven into it. Nonetheless, his greatest priority remains saving Mia, his wife, despite their troubles. Dead or not, infected or not, Ethan still represents the many themes of this game's narrative. I was actually hoping to like the Not a Hero DLC. At least, I was hoping to like it from the moment I first punched a molded. If I was going to play as Chris Redfield, then at least let me punch things into oblivion. Turns out, that wouldn't be until the end of Zoe DLC. Exploring further into Not a Hero, I later got excited when the game informed me I needed specific equipment to progress further. They were going to give me a bit of a Metroidvania experience after all. Unfortunately, the actual execution of Not a Hero was okay at best. Throwing large numbers of molded at you may have been my main gripe in the base game, but it is nothing compared to what you'll get hit with in Not a Hero. From multiple waves of molded, to narrow, poisoned corridors littered with them, to a whole new pale molded that can only be hurt by a special new ammo type, and even little facehugger type molded that just keeps spawning in large numbers. It's a combat-heavy DLC whose new enemy additions range from temporarily inconvenient to completely annoying. Much like the main game, returning with foreknowledge would no doubt be more enjoyable than an initial playthrough, but it wouldn't mitigate the frustration of key moments like the new, pale, fat man molded that acts as a boss fight. Perhaps the greatest bullet sponge in the whole of Resident Evil 7, this enemy was perhaps the most irritating monster of all, in part because he continuously spawned the aforementioned spider molded. I cannot imagine a scenario where it would be more enjoyable to fight this guy again. The only reason to play Not a Hero is to tie up the loose ends of the main game's narrative, but I kind of wish I went on wondering whatever happened to Lucas Baker instead. I already mentioned that the organization responsible for experimenting on Evelyn was named The Connections, but their actual identity is not even revealed until this DLC. The main game informs that Mia and her partner were transporting Evelyn to a new location in South America, but there was no indication that the very lab they performed such experiments in was right there in Louisiana, connected to the same mine shaft that connects right to the Baker guest house. A bit too coincidental, no? That, or they built the lab inside of the 3 years that the Bakers had been infected, which seems a bit too convenient as well. So either they set sail right when there was a hurricane headed straight for Louisiana, which also happened to be right when Evelyn would go crazy, or they managed to build all of this with no one knowing or noticing, which actually would have been even harder to manage before the Bakers were infected, wouldn't have been? Because they would have noticed before they were infected, right? So it makes more sense for this lab to have been built with no one noticing after the infection, because otherwise they would notice. But then why would Lucas have this ramshackle lab when there's a full lab right there?
Oh no, I've gone cross-eyed.
This is the real issue with the Not a Hero DLC. It is more than happy to bring back not only Chris Redfield, but the idiotic, convoluted, absurdly stupid plot contrivances that Resident Evil had, especially during Resident Evil 5 and 6. Sure, there was always B-movie camp, but it's not like things weren't getting real stupid with Code Veronica, but the more time went on, the dumber it all got to be. By winding Resident Evil 7 down to a smaller focus, to a simple theme of family and corruption with the connections being nothing more than a contextual backdrop, the game had managed to deliver a more compelling set of characters and narrative themes than the series had before. The environment, the Baker estate itself, is portrayed in such a grounded manner that the Not a Hero DLC starts to shake and even break that suspension of disbelief. As stated, the laboratory being attached to the mine and so close to the Baker estate feels unrealistic in relation to how the game has been presented thus far. This further extends to Lucas, who really could have shined far more in this DLC than the main game if it weren't for some odd narrative decisions. It makes sense that the Connections will want someone on the inside, as they no doubt wish to monitor the situation with their bioweapon and to perhaps attempt recovery. Of all the members of the Baker family, Lucas is the most suitable candidate to communicate and keep in touch with. However, employing Lucas as a researcher and then having him lead a team in experiments on the molded makes no sense. Not only is Lucas clearly unpredictable and unstable, he's an engineer. The base game goes to great lengths to establish his skills in engineering and robotics, insofar as to place his blueprints for the flamethrower and grenade launcher throughout the property. Part of that verisimilitude and suspension of disbelief I mentioned includes natural explanations for why certain things in the game world are the way they are. Jack Baker is a hunter and a Marine veteran, so of course there are guns and ammo on the premises. Lucas is a genius engineer, but he's also disturbed, and thus he would create a psychotic escape room whose sole purpose was to torture a guy before burning him alive. Just because Lucas is intelligent, though, does not mean he is a genius-level biologist capable of creating a new strain of molded. These are two different disciplines. The genius of Lucas had been used to ground gameplay tropes into something that the player can suspend their disbelief to accept, but is now treated with the same sophistication as a Saturday morning cartoon. You might say that Resident Evil has always been stupid like this, but that's not the point. Even if the prior games are this stupid, Resident Evil 7 itself was not, but is now made that stupid by the inclusion of this DLC. Which isn't to say Lucas is outright ruined as an antagonist. He still has some moments of sadistic intellect, and the idea of him having captured Redfield soldiers and using them as bait is a fitting antagonistic move. Playing off of Chris's sympathetic good guy nature is precisely what a villain like Lucas ought to be doing. Unfortunately, it all ends with Lucas becoming yet another generic Resident Evil monster to be shot down. What a miserable end. End of Zoe exists to provide a happier ending for Zoe Baker. As I said earlier, the canonical ending is to give the serum to Mia and leave Zoe behind. However, we don't play as Zoe herself. Instead, we play as Joe Baker, Jack's brother that, well, if there was any implication that Jack had a brother of importance in the main game, it was subtle and brief enough to be easily missed or forgotten. This leaves little time to establish any real character depth. Joe comes off as the sort to live off the grid and be suspicious of any centralized authority, but it doesn't really answer why he's just wandering the swamp one day to stumble upon the Blue Umbrella troops, or why he lives separate from Jack and the rest of the Bakers. He clearly loves Zoe and cares about family, but for whatever reason he's been absent this whole time. Just a reminder, Evelyn and Mia showed up 3 years ago, and Zoe has been keeping her distance for a long time to try and resist Evelyn's control. For whatever reason, Joe has done nothing to assist her or the rest of his family in those 3 years. Additionally, the very opening cutscene establishes Joe as being pretty unreasonable and foolish. There's a charm to the simplicity by which he approaches things, the sort to clearly settle things by throwing hands, but his punch first and ask questions later approach isn't going to endear him to some players. Speaking of fisticuffs, you won't have any firearms for End of Zoe, at least not until you unlock the shotgun after your first completion. I'm even curious if Joe's name is a reference to the manga and anime Ashita no Joe, given his boxing style. It's decently fun and even empowering to not only be able to punch the lights out of these molded, but to also snap their heads off with a powerful stealth kill. You know, what I was hoping I could do as Chris Redfield. There's only one new variant of molded in this DLC, a bit more armored and sturdy and thus a bit more challenging to take on. Far more preferable to the pale molded and not a hero. Melee combat isn't exactly complex, and while you can somewhat dodge attacks by strafing around enemies, you'll still have to rely on blocking most attacks in order to minimize damage. My only real gripe could be based on the controller or platform, as the game didn't always punch when I hit the triggers. The rhythm of combos also seemed a bit dicey, turning most fights into unintentional button mashing. As I said though, that could have just been a hardware issue and not a game issue. There are also gators. There are more of them than there are throwing spears you can find or craft, and they're an insta-kill if they catch up to you. I died enough times experimenting with which gators I could artfully dodge without wasting a spear, that the game asked if I wanted to drop the difficulty. It's interesting how both DLCs were decently combat heavy, but the stealth and melee approach of End of Zoe was far more effective. It actually made the molded more interesting, somewhat maintaining their threat by forcing the player to get up close and personal, but also empowering the player by enabling them to just smash these monsters apart with their hands. End of Zoe makes the decision to bring Jack back one more time as some monstrous swamp creature desperate to get his daughter back, and how you as an individual feel about this will depend on how sentimental you are. I figured out that it was Jack during the first fist fight with him. Both the glowing eye and the way he wound up his punch were obvious clues. It at least provides a dramatic dynamic between the DLC antagonist and Joe by making it his duty to put his brother down. It also indicates that, even so far gone, Jack still recognized Zoe as family and his daughter, which is why he so desperately sought to reclaim her. It's just weird to have Jack remain alive after having been killed by the serum and undergo the calcification indicative of his demise. Even Evelyn was fully killed off in this manner, but somehow Jack continued to survive and regenerate. Of course, the DLC has documentation regarding the mold beginning to mingle with the life of the swamp, as well as Jack's unusual regenerative abilities that none of the other Bakers possessed. You could argue that this swamp thing is more a collection of organisms brought together by the mold, with the last traces of Jack having been adopted from whatever active remains were absorbed into this creature. End of Zoe concludes with a power gauntlet that delivers a parting blow to Jack, ending him once and for all, and Ethan calling a cured Zoe on the phone for one more heartwarming chat. As I said, it's a good ending for Zoe, and aside from introducing Joe too late and a bit too sloppily, it's a far better experience than Not a Hero, save maybe the Gators. I don't think I find either DLC to be essential to the Resident Evil 7 experience though. They both play with interesting ideas in regards to the mechanics, but otherwise they do little for the story. In fact, I'd say you can skip all the DLC and miss nothing, but certain elements at the start of Resident Evil Village will make more sense if you've played End of Zoe. Honestly, even the banned footage DLC feels more like little game jam experiments than anything. For me though, it would have been far better to have left Lucas a loose end that got away than putting an end to him like this. I'm genuinely curious how this video will be received. I claim I'm more of an action horror fan than survival horror, and yet my biggest gripes are with the action-oriented parts of Resident Evil 7. It could seem odd that the narrative's greatest strength is how little it involves the greater franchise lore, and when the DLC leans more heavily into that lore, it collapses to me. Going back to the beginning though, I stated that even with all of its changes, I found Resident Evil 4 to have maintained, or at least reinterpreted, what I consider the spirit of the franchise. I think this is what differentiates my stance not just on Resident Evil, but any long-running series as a whole. I am alright with mechanics and even how stories are told changing so long as I find them philosophically consistent with one another. What is the philosophy of Resident Evil? I think the best entries of the series really capitalize on replayability, particularly by emphasizing a mastery of the mechanics and environment. To that end, Resident Evil 7 is a success. Through replaying it, I have grown to appreciate it more, even if it could use some refinement. Narratively speaking, there is still a fight against the corruptive influence of a biological infection. It's not a supernatural threat, but a scientific one. What Resident Evil 7 added, however, were themes involving family, corruption, and misleading the player through story and through gameplay. These are the things that made Resident Evil 7 not only a good game, but a good reinvention of the series for a new era. While Resident Evil 6 has its fans, I think its reputation is one of AAA gaming bloat and excess. Lots of money and manpower to spend on some beautiful spectacle without focus or real identity. It was the capstone of a generation where most of Capcom's new IP, such as Lost Planet and Dark Void, failed to find an audience even after chasing trends. They abandoned much of their classic IP only to reinvent a game like Bionic Commando to be edgy and nothing like the original experience. In that light, Resident Evil 7 was not only a reinvention for the franchise, it was the mark of a new era for Capcom. After disappointing fans for the entire 7th generation of consoles, it was the first title that brought the whole company back into focus and delivered to fans once again. The question was, however, what would the next entry in this franchise look like? Well, that's what we'll be discussing next time.